December 17th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Barracks 7, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto stood motionless in a tiled room he couldn't comprehend, watching steam rise from chrome fixtures that seemed to mock everything he had been taught about his enemies. Hot water. Every morning. Unlimited. For 18 months on Guadalcanal, he had bathed in muddy streams, always watching for American patrols, always thirsty, always cold despite the tropical heat. The Japanese Imperial Army had promised its soldiers they were fighting soft, decadent Americans who would crumble at the first sign of hardship. Yet here he stood, a prisoner of those same Americans, about to experience his morning shower. Hot water on demand. A luxury even Japanese officers rarely enjoyed. He turned the valve hesitantly, half expecting nothing. Scalding water erupted from the shower head, filling the room with warmth. Yamamoto stood under the stream and wept. Not from shame, not from defeat, but from the terrible realization that everything he had been told was a lie. This is the story of how hot showers, full meals, and human dignity destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility more completely than any battlefield defeat. How 5,424 Japanese prisoners of war discovered that their real enemy wasn't American soldiers, but the lies their own government had fed them. And how their transformation in American prison camps would lay the psychological groundwork for one of history's most remarkable national reconstructions. The collapse of imperial mythology began not with atomic bombs, but with running water. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was not an option. It was an impossibility. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, drilled into every recruit from his first day of training, was clear. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you. The military code of Bushido, as interpreted by the Imperial Japanese Army, offered only two honorable outcomes: victory or death. Surrender was worse than death. It was eternal dishonor, a stain on your family name that could never be washed clean. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans would torture and execute prisoners. Better to die fighting or to die by your own hand than to face what awaited in enemy captivity. This indoctrination was so complete that of the approximately 1.5 million Japanese soldiers who died in World War II, fewer than 6,000 were captured alive by American forces during the first 3 years of the war, a capture rate of less than 0.4%. When Private Yamamoto was knocked unconscious by artillery concussion on Guadalcanal in November 1944, he woke to find American medics treating his wounds. His first thought, according to his diary discovered decades later in Kyoto, was that they were preparing him for torture. His second thought was shame so profound he wished the shell had killed him. He was not alone. Lance Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, captured on Saipan after a failed banzai charge, spent his first 3 days of captivity refusing to eat, attempting to starve himself to death. Sergeant Kenji Ito, taken prisoner on Okinawa with severe burns, begged American medical staff to let him die rather than treat his injuries. The Americans, to Japanese bewilderment, refused. The journey from battlefield to prison camp began with medical treatment that defied comprehension. Japanese soldiers, taught that Americans were barbaric and cruel, instead encountered combat medics who treated enemy wounded with the same care as their own. Corporal Masao Fujimoto, captured unconscious with a shattered leg on Peleliu, woke in a field hospital. American doctors had operated on him, set his bones with metal pins, administered morphine for pain, and dressed his wounds with clean bandages. In his 1982 memoir, he described his confusion. "I had been taught that Americans were demons who would mutilate prisoners. Instead, they saved my leg. The surgeon, a captain named Henderson, checked on me daily. He spoke gently, through a Japanese-American interpreter, explaining each step of my treatment. I could not reconcile this with what I had been told." The cognitive dissonance began immediately. Japanese propaganda had prepared soldiers for torture, execution, or at best,
brutal forced labor until death. Instead, they encountered Geneva Convention protocols, medical care, and an organizational efficiency that seemed impossible for the lazy, undisciplined Americans they had been taught to despise. At collection points in the Pacific Theater, Japanese POWs were photographed, documented, given identification tags, and processed with mechanical efficiency. They received medical examinations, delousing treatments, clean uniforms, and 3 meals a day, all within 24 hours of capture. Private Yoshiro Tanaka, captured on Iwo Jima, wrote in a letter that was intercepted and later declassified, "They treated us like humans. This was unexpected. I had prepared myself for death, but instead received a blanket, food, and medicine for my dysentery. The American soldier who guarded us shared his cigarettes. I could not understand this mercy." The transport from Pacific Islands to camps in the United States provided the next phase of psychological transformation. Japanese prisoners, many seeing the ocean for the first time from a ship's deck rather than a troop transport's dark hold, traveled on vessels that defied their understanding of American military capability. The Liberty ships that carried them were the same mass-produced vessels that had stunned German POWs, but for Japanese prisoners who came from a nation struggling to maintain even basic maritime logistics, these ships represented something even more devastating, proof that American industrial capacity was essentially infinite. Sergeant Takashi Matsumoto, captured on Luzon, kept a secret diary of his voyage to America. He noted that the ship's crew disposed of more food daily than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the Philippines campaign. "The Americans throw away bread that would be treasured in Japan," he wrote. "They waste fuel oil that our Navy desperately needs. Everything is abundant. We were told they were running out of resources, that our strategy of attrition was working. This ship proves otherwise." The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. Japanese prisoners, crowded but adequately fed, watched as American crew members operated with casual efficiency. They saw radar equipment, radio communications, and navigation systems that exceeded what the Imperial Navy had available on its flagship vessels. They observed African American sailors performing complex technical operations, contradicting the racial hierarchy they had been taught justified Japanese imperialism.
Most devastatingly, they saw waste. Food waste, material waste, fuel waste. The casual disposal of resources that Japan desperately lacked. This wasn't efficiency. This was abundance so complete that waste meant nothing. Corporal Hideo Suzuki, a former factory worker from Osaka, calculated that the single ship carrying them used more fuel oil in 1 day than his entire factory had received in a month. "How can we defeat an enemy who wastes more than we produce?" he confided to another prisoner. The question would haunt thousands of Japanese POWs as they approached the American mainland. November 3, 1944, Angel Island, San Francisco Bay. The first group of Japanese prisoners to arrive at American processing facilities on the mainland stood in a receiving area, waiting for whatever came next. 147 men, most wounded, all exhausted, every one of them expecting the worst. They had been told to remove their clothes for delousing. This was it, many thought. This was where the humiliation would begin, where the Americans would reveal their true nature. In Japanese military culture, public nudity was deeply shameful. Forced stripping was a torture technique used by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, to break prisoners. Instead, they were handed towels, soap, and pointed toward a large tiled room. Private Kenji Watanabe, captured on Tarawa, had not bathed in 4 months. The last time he had been fully clean was in Tokyo before his deployment. On Tarawa, there had been no fresh water except what fell from the sky. Salt water left skin raw and itching. The humid heat bred skin infections that most Japanese soldiers simply endured as part of war. He entered the shower room expecting cold water, perhaps a bucket to share among the prisoners. Instead, he found dozens of individual shower heads, each with 2 valves, red and blue labels in English and Japanese, hot and cold. He turned both valves experimentally,
Still not believing, water erupted from the showerhead, warm at first, then hot, then scalding. He adjusted the temperature with trembling hands. The hot water hit his skin, washing away months of grime, salt, and dried blood. Steam filled the room as 147 prisoners experienced the same revelation simultaneously. Corporal Yamamoto, who we met in the opening, recorded the moment in his diary. "I stood under water that was hot, not lukewarm, hot. I could adjust the temperature myself. Nobody rushed us, nobody limited the water. We stayed until the wounds on our bodies had been cleaned, until we felt human again. I had not felt clean since I left Japan. Some men wept. I wept. The showers ran for 30 minutes. Nobody stopped them. Nobody hurried them along. American guards simply waited patiently outside, smoking cigarettes, chatting among themselves, utterly casual about a luxury that seemed miraculous to men who had spent years in deprivation." But the morning shower wasn't a one-time event for new arrivals. It was policy. Every morning, hot water, unlimited soap, clean towels, for prisoners, for enemies. Lance Corporal Nakamura, in a 1978 interview, described his first week at Camp McCoy. "Every morning at 6 a.m., we were called to the showers. Every morning, hot water. I kept waiting for this to stop, for the Americans to reveal it was a trick, a way to make us soft before the real punishment began. But it never stopped. Hot showers every day. Even American soldiers didn't always have this luxury in combat zones, but they gave it to us, their prisoners." The psychological impact was profound. The simple act of daily hot showers accomplished something that interrogation never could. It forced Japanese prisoners to confront the possibility that everything they had been told about their enemies was false. If Americans were barbaric and cruel, why did they provide hot showers? If American industrial capacity was failing, how could they afford to heat water for thousands of prisoners every day? If Americans were soft and weak, why were they winning the war while maintaining such standards for enemy captives? Sergeant Matsumoto, who had been taught that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material weakness, wrote, "They care for enemy bodies better than our own officers cared for their soldiers." In the Imperial Army, hot water was a rare luxury, available only to senior officers. Enlisted men bathed in cold water, or not at all. Here, in American captivity, enemy prisoners receive what Japanese soldiers never had. This creates uncomfortable questions. The showers were just the beginning. The morning routine at American PWS camps for Japanese prisoners followed a structure that seemed designed to systematically demolish imperial propaganda. After showers, breakfast. Private Tanaka, who had survived on rice balls and occasional fish when supplies allowed, found himself facing scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and sugar, coffee with milk, and orange juice. On the first morning. Every morning. In his memoir published posthumously in 1991, Tanaka wrote, "I thought the first breakfast was a mistake, or perhaps a propaganda show for visitors. But the next morning the same food appeared, and the next, and the next. I began to realize this was their normal ration. For prisoners. Americans fed their enemies better than Japan fed its soldiers." The daily caloric intake for Japanese PWs in American camps was approximately 3,200 calories, compared to the 1,800 to 2,000 calories that Japanese soldiers in combat zones received when supply lines were functioning, which they frequently weren't. The abundance wasn't just in quantity, but in quality. Fresh vegetables, meat at nearly every meal, dairy products that most Japanese civilians had never tasted, bread made from white flour when Japan had been mixing sawdust into rice to stretch supplies. Corporal Fujimoto, the soldier whose leg had been saved by American surgeons, wrote, "We ate better as prisoners than as soldiers, better than as civilians. I wrote to my family describing the food. The censors allowed my letter through. I think they wanted Japanese people to know. My mother received the letter 6 months later, after the war ended. She thought I was lying to protect her from worrying about my treatment. But the morning showers and abundant food were components of something larger and more devastating to Japanese military psychology. Systematic evidence that American industrial capacity was beyond anything Japanese propaganda had admitted. The camps themselves were monuments to American construction capability. Camp McCoy, which held up to 3,800 Japanese prisoners at its peak, had been built in 90 days. Barracks with central heating, indoor plumbing, electric lighting, medical facilities with X-ray machines and surgical suites, kitchens that could prepare meals for thousands. Every building constructed with more lumber than most Japanese villages possessed. Every room wired for electricity that flowed continuously, never rationed, never cut off. Steam heat in winter that kept buildings at 68 degrees Fahrenheit while Wisconsin temperatures dropped below zero outside. Private Watanabe, who had grown up in a farming village outside Hiroshima, calculated that the single camp that held him used more electricity in one day than his entire village had used in a year. They left lights burning in empty rooms, he noted in his diary. American guards complained about being cold if the heat dropped below 65 degrees. We thought this was incredible weakness until we realized it revealed incredible strength. They could afford to waste more than we could produce. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some prisoners. The disparity between what they had been taught and what they witnessed was so extreme that some experienced psychological breaks, refusing to believe the evidence before their eyes. Sergeant Ito, who had attempted suicide rather than accept capture, spent his first month in Camp Livingston, Louisiana, in what American psychiatrists documented as dissociative fugue. He performed tasks, ate meals, took his hot showers, but seemed mentally absent, unable to reconcile his reality with his training. American military psychiatrists, some of them Japanese American, treated him without coercion or punishment. They provided therapy, medication for anxiety, and patient counseling. He slowly emerged from his psychological crisis, but the man who emerged was fundamentally changed. In a 1980 interview, Ito recalled, "I had been prepared to die for the emperor. I had been taught that death was preferable to capture, that Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Instead, they gave me hot showers, good food, and medical care for my mind as well as my body. They treated my shame and confusion as an illness to be healed, not a weakness to be punished. I realized then that I had been lied to about everything."
The morning shower, that simple daily ritual, became a symbol of a larger truth that Japanese POWs couldn't avoid. American prosperity was real, American industrial might was genuine, and Japanese propaganda had prepared them for war against a phantom enemy that bore no resemblance to reality. Every morning, hot water washed away a little more of imperial mythology. Every morning, the evidence mounted, and every morning, more Japanese prisoners began to wonder what else they had been lied to about. By early 1945, over 5,000 Japanese prisoners were being held in camps across the American mainland. Labor shortages, particularly in agriculture and non-military industries, led to the same employment programs that had been implemented for German and Italian POWs. This decision, driven by economic necessity, would provide Japanese prisoners with an education and American industrial capacity that would prove more devastating than any military defeat. Under Geneva Convention provisions, prisoners could be employed in work that didn't directly contribute to the war effort. Japanese POWs found themselves working in farms, lumber mills, food processing plants, and other civilian industries across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and the Mountain West. What they witnessed shattered their understanding of the war. March 1945, a lumber mill outside Missoula, Montana. 37 Japanese prisoners, under minimal guard, operated equipment that processed more timber in 1 hour than a traditional Japanese sawmill handled in a week. Electric-powered bandsaws, automated conveyors, mechanical lumber stackers, all operated by prisoners who had been taught that American industrial efficiency was a myth.
Corporal Fujimoto, whose shattered leg had been reconstructed by American surgeons, found himself assigned to quality control. He watched as perfectly good lumber was rejected for minor knots or slight warping, timber that would have been precious in Japan simply discarded because America could afford to waste it. The mill produced 50,000 board feet of lumber daily, he recorded in his journal. Japan's entire lumber production in 1944 was estimated at 500 million board feet annually. This single mill, in this small Montana town, produced 1/10,000th of Japan's entire national output every single day. There were thousands of such mills across America. The mathematics were devastating. Japanese prisoners, many of whom had received technical or engineering education before conscription, could calculate what these observations meant. If one small-town mill in Montana produced this much, and America had hundreds of such mills, the productive disparity between America and Japan wasn't just large, it was insurmountable. Private Tanaka, assigned to a food processing plant in Idaho, witnessed industrial food production that made Japanese agriculture look medieval. A single potato processing facility handled more potatoes in one shift than his entire prefecture produced in a month.
Machines washed, sorted, peeled, and cut potatoes, he wrote. Conveyor belts moved continuously. Women, many of them middle-aged, operated controls while chatting and listening to music. They were not working hard by Japanese standards, yet production never stopped. Everything was mechanized, efficient, wasteful in its abundance. The waste devastated Japanese prisoners more than the abundance. America could afford to discard what Japan desperately needed. Bruised potatoes went to pig feed. Slightly overripe tomatoes were plowed under. Grain with minor pest damage was rejected for human consumption. Sergeant Matsumoto, working at a grain elevator in Wyoming, watched as train cars full of wheat arrived continuously from farms that stretched beyond the horizon. Each train carried more grain than his hometown received in an entire year of rationing. I asked the foreman how much wheat America produced annually, Matsumoto recalled in his 1972 memoir. He didn't know the exact number, but he said enough to feed every person on Earth. I thought he was exaggerating. After the war, I looked up the statistics. In 1945, America produced approximately 1.1 billion bushels of wheat. He wasn't exaggerating. He was understating. But the most psychologically devastating observations came from those prisoners who witnessed American military production indirectly through civilian industry. At a rubber plant in Akron, Ohio, Japanese POWs unloaded synthetic rubber that would become tires for military vehicles. The facility produced more rubber in 1 month than Japan's entire synthetic rubber program had achieved in a year, despite Japan having pioneered the technology. Lance Corporal Nakamura, a chemistry student before the war, understood the implications immediately. This was one plant. The foreman told us there were dozens of similar facilities across America. Japan had bet everything on capturing rubber supplies from Southeast Asia. America had simply built factories and made rubber from petroleum. They didn't need to conquer anyone, they just made what they needed. The trains that transported prisoners between camps and work sites provided mobile classrooms in American geography and infrastructure. Japanese POWs, many of whom had never traveled more than 50 miles from their birthplace before military service, crossed vast distances that redefined their understanding of America's size and resources. The journey from San Francisco to Camp McCoy took 3 days by train. 3 days of continuous travel through farmland, forests, mountains, cities, and industrial zones. Private Watanabe, whose entire worldview had been shaped by Japan's small, resource-poor islands, found the experience almost hallucinogenic. "We traveled for 3 days and never left America," he wrote. "Japan, including all conquered territories, could fit inside the distance we traveled. The train passed farms where single families owned more land than entire Japanese villages. We passed cities larger than Tokyo, one after another, each one lit up at night like it was peacetime. The electric lights proved especially devastating to Japanese military psychology. Japan had implemented strict blackout regulations since 1942. Cities were dark. Factories operated behind blackout curtains. Even before the war, electricity was expensive and rationed. Yet as prisoner trains crossed America at night, Japanese POWs saw a nation that appeared to have forgotten it was at war. Cities blazed with light. Factories ran night shifts with illuminated windows. Even farms had electric lights burning. Small towns in Wyoming had more electric illumination than major Japanese cities. Corporal Yamamoto calculated that the small Montana town near his lumber camp used more electricity in one night than his entire Tokyo neighborhood received in a month. They are fighting a war on two fronts, defeating Germany and defeating us simultaneously. Yet they have so much electricity they illuminate empty streets all night. We are losing not because we are weak, but because they are impossibly strong. By spring 1945, the cumulative psychological impact of these observations was creating what American intelligence officers called cooperative collapse among Japanese prisoners. Unlike German POWs, who had maintained military discipline and organization within camps, Japanese prisoners began abandoning the strict hierarchical structure that had defined their military experience. Senior NCOs, who in Japanese military culture wielded almost unlimited authority over lower ranks, found their authority evaporating. Prisoners began making individual decisions, questioning orders, and most significantly requesting access to American newspapers, magazines, and educational materials. Major Terasawa Roberto, a Japanese-American intelligence officer who worked with POWs at Camp McCoy, reported in April 1945, "The transformation is remarkable. Prisoners who arrived prepared to die rather than cooperate are now asking to learn English, to understand American agriculture, to study American industrial methods. They have seen too much. The evidence has overwhelmed their indoctrination." The camp newspapers, initially published by American authorities in Japanese, gradually began accepting prisoner contributions. These articles provide a window into the psychological transformation occurring behind barbed wire. An anonymous article from April 1945, published in the Camp McCoy newsletter, read, "We were told America was weak, that Americans were soft and undisciplined, that their mongrel race could never match Japanese purity and strength. Every day in this camp proves those teachings were lies. The Americans who guard us are not weak. They are confident in the way only the truly strong can be. They do not need to prove their strength through cruelty, because their strength is self-evident." Another article, signed only with a prisoner number, stated, "I worked today in a factory where women operated machinery. In Japan, we were taught that women could not do men's work, that American women working in factories proved American weakness and desperation. But I watched these women operate complex equipment efficiently while their husbands fought overseas. This is not weakness. This is a nation so strong it can mobilize everyone and still defeat us." The most devastating revelations came through American casualness about information security. Guards spoke openly about production figures, military operations, and strategic plans in ways that would have resulted in court-martial in the Japanese military. But Americans, secure in their overwhelming superiority, saw no reason to hide the truth. Japanese prisoners learned that America produced one aircraft every 5 minutes. They learned that American shipyards could build an escort carrier in 3 months. They learned that Ford's Willow Run plant manufactured a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes.
They learned that American food production was sufficient to feed not just Americans, but also Britain, the Soviet Union, and Allied forces worldwide. Every statistic, every casual revelation, every glimpse behind the curtain of American industrial might delivered the same devastating message. Japan had challenged an enemy so far beyond its capacity that defeat was never in question. The only question had been how long it would take. Sergeant Ito, who had recovered from his psychological crisis, wrote in May 1945, "We fought bravely. Our soldiers were courageous. Our pilots were skilled. Our sailors were dedicated. But bravery cannot defeat steel. Courage cannot overcome production. Dedication cannot match resources. We brought samurai swords to fight an industrial colossus." The outcome was never in doubt. But American industrial might was only half of the psychological transformation occurring in prisoner camps. The other half, perhaps more powerful, was something Japanese military culture had no framework to comprehend: humanity toward enemies. The Japanese military operated on principles of absolute hierarchy and brutal discipline. Inferiors obeyed superiors without question. Failure was punished with violence. Weakness was met with contempt. Prisoners, whether Allied soldiers captured by Japanese forces or Japanese soldiers who failed their duties, were treated with systematic cruelty that was considered not just acceptable, but proper. Japanese prisoners arrived in American camps expecting similar treatment. They had been warned that Americans would torture them, work them to death, or simply execute them. The truth proved far more devastating to imperial ideology than any brutality could have been. December 1944. Private Watanabe's younger brother had died in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The news reached him through the International Red Cross, 3 weeks after the battle. He sat in the barracks at Camp McCoy, holding the thin paper that had traveled halfway around the world to deliver the news, and wept openly. An American guard, a sergeant from Iowa named James Morrison, saw him crying. In the Japanese military, showing emotion was weakness, and weakness was punished. Watanabe prepared himself for mockery or violence. Instead, Sergeant Morrison sat down beside him, awkwardly silent for a moment, then said through an interpreter, "I lost my brother at Normandy. I'm sorry for your loss." He offered Watanabe a cigarette, sat with him for 20 minutes in silence, then quietly left. No mockery, no punishment. Just one soldier acknowledging another's grief. Watanabe would later write, "In that moment, something broke inside me. Not my spirit, but my certainty. I had been taught that Americans were inhuman, that they felt no compassion, that they would treat prisoners with cruelty. This sergeant, whose brother had died fighting my countrymen, showed me more kindness than my own officers had shown in 3 years of service. I began to question everything I had been taught."
This pattern repeated across every camp, in countless small moments that accumulated into a psychological avalanche. American guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. Camp commanders personally visited sick POWs in the hospital. Medical staff treated prisoners with the same care as American soldiers. Kitchen staff prepared food that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. But the most devastating act of humanity came in an unexpected form: education for prisoners of a nation that America was still actively fighting. In January 1945, while American forces were still battling Japanese soldiers in the Philippines, the War Department authorized educational programs for Japanese POWs. English classes, American history courses, vocational training, even university-level correspondence courses through American institutions. The University of California, Berkeley, despite having Japanese-American students and faculty who had been interned just 3 years earlier, offered correspondence courses to Japanese POWs. Stanford University sent textbooks. The American Library Association shipped thousands of books in Japanese and English to camp libraries. Lance Corporal Nakamura, who had been a chemistry student before conscription, enrolled in correspondence courses through Berkeley. He wrote in 1946, "My nation was fighting against America. American soldiers were dying daily fighting against Japanese forces. Yet American universities offered to teach me, an enemy prisoner. They sent textbooks, graded my papers, provided feedback to help me learn. This generosity toward an enemy was incomprehensible." Over 1,200 Japanese prisoners enrolled in educational programs by spring 1945. They studied English, mathematics, agriculture, engineering, and American civics. They read American novels, newspapers, and magazines freely. They watched American films, including frank depictions of American social problems that would never have been shown in Japan. Private Tanaka, who had barely finished elementary school before working in his father's shop, learned to read and write English in an American prison camp. The teacher was a Japanese-American woman whose family had been interned just 3 years earlier. She had every reason to hate us, to refuse to help, to see us as the enemy. Instead, she taught us patiently, corrected our mistakes gently, and encouraged us to learn. I asked her why. She said, "Because the war will end, and you'll need to rebuild your country. Education will help you do that." She was thinking about Japan's future, while Japan was still fighting her country. The treatment of sick and wounded prisoners provided another lesson in American humanity that Japanese military culture couldn't comprehend. Japanese military medicine operated on brutal efficiency. If a soldier could be returned to duty, he received treatment. If he couldn't, he was often left to die. Resources were too scarce to waste on the permanently disabled. American military medicine operated on different principles. Every soldier, every prisoner, received treatment regardless of whether they could return to service. Amputees received prosthetics. The blind received rehabilitation training. Those with severe injuries received long-term care. Corporal Fujimoto, whose shattered leg had been rebuilt with metal pins, received physical therapy for 6 months. American medical staff worked patiently to restore his mobility, providing him with crutches, then a cane, then exercises to walk independently. By April 1945, he could walk almost normally, though with a slight limp. They spent more resources healing one enemy prisoner's leg than Japan spent on entire field hospitals, he wrote. The therapist, a woman named Alice who had trained as a nurse before the war, worked with me 3 times a week for 6 months. She celebrated when I could walk across the room. She was genuinely happy that an enemy soldier had recovered. This was not propaganda. This was who they were. The medical treatment extended beyond physical care to psychological support. Japanese prisoners suffering from what we now call PTSD, depression, or anxiety, received psychiatric care without stigma or punishment. American psychiatrists, some of them Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, treated Japanese prisoners who had fought for an ally of Nazi Germany with professional compassion. Sergeant Ito, who had suffered a severe psychological break after capture, received months of psychiatric care. Dr. Goldman, who had fled Germany in 1938, treated me like a patient who needed help, not an enemy who deserved punishment, Ito recalled. He helped me understand that my trauma was a natural response to impossible circumstances, not a personal failing. In the Japanese military, such weakness would have resulted in punishment or discharge with dishonor. Here, it was treated as an injury deserving care. But perhaps the most powerful demonstration of American humanity came through an institution that existed nowhere in Japanese military culture, the prisoner mail system.
Japanese POWs were allowed to send and receive mail through the International Red Cross. Letters were censored for security, but personal correspondence was permitted and even encouraged. This simple act proved psychologically revolutionary. In Japanese military culture, a soldier who surrendered was dead to his family. The shame of capture was considered so complete that families were expected to perform funeral rites and sever all connection. Many Japanese prisoners believed their families had disowned them, that letters would be refused or returned unopened.
The American policy, explained through interpreters, was clear. Prisoners could write home. Families could write back. The connection could be maintained. Private Watanabe wrote his first letter home in February 1945, unsure if his family would respond. 6 weeks later, he received a reply from his mother. She was alive, struggling with food shortages, worried about American bombing raids, but alive. And she had not disowned him. I received 3 more letters from her before the war ended, Watanabe wrote in his memoir. Each one made me more grateful to the Americans who had established this mail system. My government had taught me that I was dead to my family if captured. America gave me back that connection. They understood that even enemies were human beings with families who loved them. By spring 1945, over 3,000 Japanese prisoners were receiving regular mail from families in Japan. The psychological impact was profound. Prisoners who believed they were dishonored ghosts, dead to everyone they loved, discovered that human connection could survive even war. The contrast between American treatment of prisoners and Japanese treatment of Allied POWs became increasingly obvious as the war progressed. Reports of the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railroad, and systematic mistreatment of Allied POWs reached some Japanese POWs through American newspapers and newsreels. The response varied. Some refused to believe it, dismissing it as propaganda. Others, confronted with the evidence, experienced profound shame. Many began to question not just specific policies, but the entire system they had served. An anonymous letter found in Camp McCoy archives, dated May 1945. I have read accounts of how our military treated American prisoners. I have read about the Death March, about labor camps, about systematic cruelty. I cannot verify these reports, but I can compare them to my own experience. If these reports are true, then we were not warriors. We were criminals serving criminals. The shame is not that we surrendered. The shame is what we did before we surrendered. This reckoning with Japanese war crimes would deepen after the war's end, but even before Japan's surrender, many prisoners were beginning to understand that they had served an evil cause, that their personal honor and courage had been used by dishonorable leaders for dishonorable purposes.
The final demonstration of American humanity came in an unexpected form: preparation for the future. In April 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, camp administrators began vocational training programs for prisoners. Carpentry, agriculture, mechanical repair, electrical work. Skills that prisoners could use to rebuild Japan after the war. The premise was stunning. America was preparing its enemies to reconstruct the nation America was still fighting. While American bombers were destroying Japanese cities, American instructors were teaching Japanese prisoners how to rebuild them. Corporal Yamamoto, who took courses in agricultural techniques and small business management, wrote, "They were teaching us how to defeat them in peace the way we could not defeat them in war. They were giving us the tools to build a Japan that could compete with America through prosperity rather than conquest." This confidence in their own system was more impressive than their weapons. By August 1945, when news of Japan's surrender finally reached the prison camps, over 5,000 Japanese prisoners had been transformed. not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. They had witnessed American industrial might, they had experienced American humanity, and they had begun to understand that everything they had been taught about their enemies and their cause was a lie. The surrender announcement was met not with shame, but with relief. Relief that the killing would stop. Relief that Japan might survive. And for many, relief that they might be able to take what they had learned and use it to build something better. Private Tanaka wrote in his diary on August 15, 1945, "The Emperor has announced our surrender. I feel no shame. I am not dead to my family. I am not dishonored. I am educated, fed, healthy, and alive. And I will return to Japan with knowledge that might help us build a nation worthy of the sacrifices our people have made. America has defeated us, but America has also prepared us to rise again. This is the behavior of a civilization, not an enemy."